On the English language debate night in 2008, I'd spent the day running about. I'd started the morning speaking to a women's executive breakfast, and then went to Toronto and back to do George Strombolopoulos in the hour. I showed up at the leaders' debate, and one would think that I might have been nervous, and I was, to go live national television and discuss issues that mattered with the other federal party leaders. I found tonight's experience much more difficult. Was watching from a remote location. Thanks to Vancouver Sun and Czech, I was able to try to be posting online comments. Thanks to CBC, I could post online comments. But overall, I was watching the same predictable, stale, useless partisanship we see in the House of Commons on a day-to-day basis. We had questions from video presentations from voters. Before we found out the consortium had decided I wasn't allowed in the debates, the Green Party had sent a proposal to the consortium to improve the debates, assuming, of course, that we'd be in them. We'd suggested a live studio audience that could ask any question they wanted of the leaders, to make it more spontaneous, to try to break down the staginess of the whole event. I know how the other leaders prepared in 2008 for the English language debates because all of this internal mystique is shared. And the other leaders, they didn't do other interviews that day. They stayed being groomed, being scripted, doing fake debates with people pretending to be the other leaders. In other words, they didn't prepare to deal with the issues, and they didn't prepare to engage with the Canadians. They were prepared by their spin doctors and groomers to deliver a line with just the right zing. Where's your platform? Under your sweater? I remember when Jack said that, I was thinking, where'd that come from? That seems so out of place at that moment. I profoundly believe that what we need in Canadian politics is to get away from the scripted, away from the partisan, away from political party leaders and media deciding what Canadians want to hear, and reopen and re-engage democracy so that Canadians can ask the questions directly, that the whole event can become more spontaneous and less scripted, and that the issues that are orphaned by the political elites can get back in the forefront. We had, thanks to the way the consortium organized the debate, so this isn't the leaders' fault, they chose 5 questions. Why these 5? I don't know. I think for purpose of just making a point, today is the global day for action on military spending. Well, that certainly didn't come up. We had a question on cutting the corporate tax rates, question on health, question on the vision for Canada and the world, multiculturalism, immigration, and one on crime. So the orphaned issues, as I predicted, of course, First Nations and our concern for what we're doing in First Nations communities. Where are we? We had the Kelowna Accord in 2005. It's been abandoned. We had the apology for the residential school systems, which Mr. Harper gave, I think, quite impressively in the House of Commons. But he said, now that apologies are over, is the time to show that we're serious and actually rebuild the relationship and make sure that First Nations communities are not living in conditions that no other Canadians would accept. That promise has been broken. That issue didn't come up. Women's rights. The condition for women in Canada did not get discussed. Why we are seeing the closing of status of women offices. Why groups that worked to get women out of poverty have lost their funding. None of that came up. Strangely enough, when discussing Canada's role in the world, our position in Libya didn't come up. Isn't that interesting? What are we doing in Libya? Here are 4 leaders of political parties. Of course, I can't say national parties because Mr. Ducep's party isn't national. Apparently all agreeing that Canada should dispatch forces to Libya without a clear idea of what we're doing, where we're going. If I'd been in the room as the only party leader who wasn't part of that decision, perhaps we could have gotten to some real issues there. How long do we stay in Libya? Are we there to protect human life from Muammar Gaddafi's revenge, a position the Greens support? Or are we there to engage in a civil war for regime change, a position the Greens do not support? That didn't come up. There are so many issues, including major economic questions. It's not just that the Green Party leader would raise issues about social issues and health and disadvantaged groups within Canada, such as our disabled population. I would have talked about the productivity gap. That is a core issue. And we've heard, Greens heard from a former Assistant Deputy Minister of Finance, Don Drummond, that if we don't deal with the productivity gap in this country, We cannot just sit back on our laurels and assume that we're going to continue to have a healthy economy. For the first time in decades, we're falling behind the U.S. on our productivity gap. That should have been discussed. When discussing health care, there was no discussion of pharmacare. We really need to address the excessive level of control over pharmaceutical drug prices and access to our markets of the pharmaceutical industry. The list of orphaned issues is long. Food policy, help for our farmers, how to prevent oil tankers on our coastline, and where we're going in terms of energy policy. There was no discussion of arts funding, nothing about the long-term funding and support for our public broadcaster. As again, I said, another orphaned issue that's large, and Naheed Nenshi, the mayor of Calgary, made this point in an article to the Calgary Herald. Cities, municipalities, and appropriate funding for cities is another orphan issue in this election. And he made the point that only the Green Party had a substantive and comprehensive proposal for our cities. Again, the list is long of issues that didn't get discussed because I wasn't in the room. Of the issues that were discussed, let me just say on the climate question, I think all the leaders made some effort to talk about climate, because I'd said before the debates that if I wasn't there, we wouldn't hear about climate. So we heard the word climate, but we did not hear an intelligent conversation. We did not hear clear commitments. And we heard some, I think, quite unfortunate misstatements of fact from certainly Mr. Harper's position that Canada has been a leader in any way, shape, or form. It is not supported by the facts. The Copenhagen Accord, which he heralds, is seen by people around the world not as a promise of climate action, but as an obstacle to climate action. So that wasn't dealt with by the other leaders. Had I been there, I think I could have dealt with it very effectively. I appreciate that you're here tonight. I'd like to say that this will be, I think, remembered by history books as a dark day for Canadian democracy. That we could have a debate with 4 out of 5 federal party leaders of substantive, serious political parties. That debate could concentrate on a pre-selected handful of issues without spontaneity. And I think for most Canadian voters, that debate will not encourage them to become engaged in Canadian democracy. My efforts from now till May 2nd and those of Green Party candidates right across the country will be focused on getting the message out. Look at our platform. Look at our proposals. They're pragmatic. They're serious. They're actually more serious about the economy than the little bit of a gong show we saw tonight in the leaders' debate. Look at what we're proposing to early childhood education, to helping young people dealing with quite persistent levels of youth unemployment, the need for job training, the need for mass transit, investments in our future. Our policies and our proposals are very strong, positive, realistic proposals for Canada. It's my hope that once in the House of Commons, Greens will work well with others. If our policies can't be put forward 100%, but something close is proposed by another party, we'll work with them, because it's much more important that we make progress on these issues than that we survive untainted to claim the credit for something that we can achieve decades from now. Now is the time for action on climate. Now is the time for action to protect our healthcare system. Now is the time for changes in our foreign policy to ensure that once again we're a nation known for peacekeeping. Now is the time for action to address a deficit in ways that allow the Canadian economy to modernize, create hundreds of thousands of new jobs while breaking our addiction to fossil fuels. These things aren't dreams. They can be achieved. And I wish that tonight, in this sad spectacle of a partial leaders' debates, some of the issues that Greens care about could have come to the fore. We'll do everything we can between now and May 2nd to bring those issues to Canadians on their doorstep, through their Twitter accounts, through Facebook, through virtual communication, and most importantly of all, by being a very accessible party with an open door to anyone who has a question. And that includes all of you in the room tonight. So if you have any questions, please feel free to answer them, to ask them now. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un ici pour le midi en français? Okay, we don't need any French. Just checking. Any questions?
You said that the environment would have been more focused in the debate if you were there. Can you
Well, let's look. Yeah, I mean, in fairness to the party leaders, none of the questions that the media chose to ask had anything to do with the most important threat to our survival on the planet as a healthy civilization. I mean, it's civilization itself that's at risk from the climate crisis. It wasn't a question that was asked because the media has decided climate change isn't an issue. I mean, I think it's very odd that the media can decide what the important issues are. They did attempt to raise it. I put a mark down every time. I had a page for orphaned issues that I organized for myself. I did hear some comments, for instance, on Africa. I thought that might be abandoned. But on climate, certainly Mr. Harper made a point of trying to claim that his government had done something on climate. The NDP made a few points about climate. But we didn't have a serious discussion. If you recall, in 2008, I tried to bring the discussion about climate to some of the science, to ask some questions about specifically what would the other parties do. Were they on board with the targets that we've signed on to internationally? How do we meet those targets while expanding, growing our economy, creating new jobs? So the discussion that happened was, I think, just to be able to say, I mentioned climate. So some of the leaders could say, yeah, I mentioned climate. But did they offer anything substantive? No, they didn't. And if I'd been in the room, I wouldn't have let them get away with that.
But when you said your orphan issues, you didn't mention environment.
Because I said I had climate down and they put a tick mark next to each one of them. Now, climate isn't the only environmental issue. There's a lot of other environmental issues that we could call orphaned. One of my orphaned issues, I don't know if I read it out loud, was water, oil tankers. I mean, there are a range of issues that weren't mentioned tonight. And I'm really, the poverty issues were not really raised at all. What are they? Corporate concentration of media ownership was one of my orphaned issues. Nobody raised that at all. I mentioned the product homelessness, nuclear power. These were on my personal list of orphaned issues that I was watching. Certainly, in the wake of the Fukushima disaster, you'd think someone might have mentioned nuclear power and why in the 2011 budget the Harper Conservatives increased substantially the taxpayer subsidies to AECL. What for? Why? Why go to $800 million this year when we're fighting a deficit for a crown corporation that we expect to be selling? Just to, sort of spruce it up and hope some buyer will want it. So, again, the orphaned issue list is quite long. I would have done my best. You can't raise every issue every time. In terms of crime policy, for instance, I did put on the online accounts. Let's look at some serious, it was at a level of pretty superficial debate. The crime rate is going down. Stephen Harper wants to be tough on crime. Well, let's examine that. Some of the reasons Canadians feel the system is weak is that we do see people not show up for their hearings. If you look at it, and I've practiced law, and I have a lot of friends who are involved in criminal justice, we don't actually ever go after people who post bail for people who've been charged and don't show up. There's some fixes in the existing system that make more sense than saying we're going to be tough on crime and bring in mandatory minimums. Everyone knows, everybody who's ever studied this empirically knows that mandatory minimums don't work. They create a burden on the taxpayer, and they essentially constitute a crime school. The other thing I posted online is if we want to liberate law enforcement reserves, let's stop the failed prohibition strategy on cannabis. It's not working. And the World Health Organization, looking at health risks, finds it comparable to alcohol and cigarettes, and we were devoting law enforcement resources towards something that isn't the problem. We need to deal with grow-ops, get rid of organized crime by legalizing, taxing, and regulating marijuana. Once that's done, we'd be removing the threat of these grow-ops within suburban neighborhoods. There are a lot of common sense things we can do that weren't mentioned by the other leaders on every one of the issues that came up in the discussion. So again, I'm disappointed, and I think democracy lost out when they kept out a party that had 1 million votes in the last election. I knew they were changing the format. I don't know how the rest of you felt. We'll see what happens and what the punditry says in the morning. But I thought that was a spectacularly non-engaging, flat, predictable set of exchanges.
Who should decide who's in the debate? And secondary, one of the proposals you suggested is allowing a panel of a live audience.
Right.
I think we all understand what would happen in that scenario is the parties would plant people. It's 4 o'clock in the morning to line up and plant their questions. So, how do you actually get to a debate, and who should make these decisions?
Actually, what we propose to the consortium is that they should accept requests from Canadians from coast to coast who want to be at the debate, and then do it like a jury, an actual lotto, draw the names and say, okay, you're in. So the live studio audience would be, as much as possible, nonpartisan, not there as a chump. I have enormous respect for the ability of Canadians to be nonpartisan in that setting, to ask real questions, and to expect a real answer. Because when you have a canned video presentation, you couldn't go back to any of those people and say, did that answer your question? And I think in a lot of occasions you would have found that Robert or Jade or people who were asking the question would have said, I don't think that was really responsive to what I asked. So who should organize the debates? I'm very supportive of the proposals by the Centre for the Study of Democracy at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. They looked at this issue. They felt that the 2008 debates had shown that the consortium didn't know how to manage the process. They had no rules, no guidelines, and they're obviously in a conflict of interest. They're running the debates. They're looking at programming concerns. They're trying to produce what they say. We're trying to produce good television. Well, if that's your goal, perhaps that gets in the way of providing useful public information for the voter. Perhaps they want to, as this debate clearly was trying to do, deliver the opportunity for some kind of knockout punch from one leader to the other, as opposed to a useful exploration of the issues. At one point when they were all talking over each other, I think, boy, voters are just going to be sitting at home turning off the set. So an independent commission with guidelines and guidance. We had proposed the consortium, by the way, in 2007 actually asked the Green Party for help because they said, we don't have any rules, we don't have any criteria, we would like to have some. So we proposed some. By then the consortium changed its chair, and our proposals, I don't think they obviously didn't go anywhere, but we clearly need rules, we clearly need guidance for this group. Maybe it's through passing an amendment to the Elections Act, which describes how the leaders' debate should be handled. But I think, you never know about predictions, but I think it's a pretty safe bet that by the next federal election campaign, the media consortium will have packed it in and no one will trust them to ever run a debate again because this was a travesty.
So going back to the environment again, what do you think the four other parties don't care about the environment? It's not a major issue in Canada?
Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? They haven't made it part of their platform. They haven't made it one of the issues that they take across the country when they're talking about what they're concerned about. They treat the environment the way the media, the national level, seems to treat the environment and climate change issues, as though it's a fashion statement. In this year, out the next. And the reality of our situation on the planet is one that requires urgent action. It's quite stunning to me. I participate in the international negotiations that take place within the UN system. And in the last one in Mexico, Canada actually signed on to some pretty strong language. But our own policies won't get us anywhere near, not even in the ballpark. We have the lowest target for reduction of greenhouse gases of any industrialized country. And we're the only country that signed and ratified Kyoto, which is a legally binding treaty. We're the only country that signed and ratified and stands in flagrant violation of our commitments, having stood up and said we have no intention of trying to reach them. We're the only ones. So when Stephen Harper talks about law and order, he's quite selective. International law and international treaties to which we are bound, he regards as nothing more than political promises that are like Kleenexes that he can rip up. So it's distressing, to put it lightly, what's happening. And again, we treat climate in our Green Party platform as more of an economic and energy policy question than an environmental question. Our environmental policy statements go to issues like biodiversity, how to ensure that we have a complete national park system. Locally, we need to expand the Gulf Islands Park so that we have what was always planned, the marine park component of the Gulf Islands Marine Park. I mean, you have a quite, remarkable suggestion from the Harper government that we should go ahead and create in Metro Toronto the Rouge Valley as a national park. Lovely idea, but in terms of resources, where we really need to expand the national park system is in marine national parks, where we're way, way behind. The Rouge Valley area has been protected by provincial action, so putting federal resources there is a transparent effort to expand votes in a safe Liberal riding. So, I mean, I look at where the other parties are on their environmental commitments, and they're missing in action. Yeah.
Is there anything you assumed was going to be an orphan issue, but surprisingly turned up in the debate? So.
I was pleased to see any reference to our commitment to Africa. Both Michael Ignatieff and Jack Layton spoke about Africa and came back a few times to the failure, which was quite horrific, of the bill to finally live up to Canada's commitment to deliver retroviral and HIV drugs to Africa. So that did come up. I had it on my list as an orphan issue that I thought might remain orphaned. We certainly heard the words climate, although, again, the consortium's choice of questioning did not include any environment or climate content. We heard it mentioned, but not really dealt with. I was hoping I was wrong about First Nations being an orphan issue. Sean Atleo, the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, spoke yesterday in Toronto at the Canadian Club and challenged all the parties because other than the Greens, he hasn't seen any substantive commitment on First Nations, on justice, on changing the way in which we're dealing with land claims, and on restoring the commitment that was there in 2005 from all provincial governments and the federal government to move ahead with the Kelowna Accord. I was surprised, considering, again, the Fukushima disaster. Interesting that nuclear issues didn't come up. Homelessness, unless I missed it, I didn't hear. Sometimes I had to unplug my earphone to do a direct intervention online. So if I've missed anything, but I didn't hear anyone mention homelessness. And that's, the lack of a social housing, the lack of an affordable housing strategy in Canada is a significant problem. No references to cities, municipal infrastructure, the need for mass transit. There were quite a long list of issues that remained orphaned, and I'm again saddened by that. I think we're going to have to look at these leaders' debates and figure out how to make them more useful to voters. I mean, I'll certainly suspend judgment to see what the online chat is like tomorrow, how Canadians feel about what they saw tonight, how many people watched it, and how many people were just angry because of my exclusion. I think we have never asked people to boycott watching the leaders' debate. We think any exercise in democracy is worth participation, even when it's a diminished experience like the one we had tonight. But I have a feeling a lot of people be interested to see the ratings for 2011 compared to 2008 and see how the consortium's decision to exclude the Greens worked out for Canadian voters. Yes, Sandy.
I just wonder, proportional representation did come up.
Yeah.
My goodness, what's it going to take in this country to actually make that happen?
Well, I thought that was ironic because hearing Jack Layton speaking to the unfairness to the Greens, if the leaders, there's a lot of hypocrisy that's been going on in this leaders' debate debacle. We're now seeing the letters that people who've written CBC getting back, and of course the CBC is hiding behind the other leaders. They're saying all party leaders agreed. Obviously, I didn't. So then there's a presumption about who the party leaders are. But they're also hiding behind Mr. Ignatieff, Mr. Layton, Mr. Harper, Mr. Duceppe. And they're saying it was the consortium's decision. So that's pretty discouraging about courage. And what they all said was that they wouldn't, Mr. Harper said he wouldn't mind me being there. The others said, we think she should be there. But it's pretty clear what those leaders do when they really want to affect a consortium decision, which is the action that they took to get the French debate changed to avoid a conflict with a hockey game, in which case Mr. Duceppe wrote a letter, got the other leaders to sign on. Wow, there's real commitment to democracy if you've got a conflict with hockey. But nothing for something that Mr. Layton just claimed to think was an unfair situation, that when we had nearly as many votes as the Bloc Québécois, they have 49 seats, we have none, and we're shut out of the debate for no reason. So in order to get proportional representation, I think we look around the world at how countries like us have handled it, other Commonwealth nations, and I think we're more likely to get proportional representation at the federal level than at a provincial level first. I think we need to, as we're advocating in our platform, we need to have a fundamental inquiry into the health of Canadian democracy. We need to look at issues like the excessive control, increased budget, and increased person power of the Prime Minister's office, as though it was some sort of organ of government. It doesn't exist in our Constitution. There is no way that we should be seeing the power and control and growth in budget of the Prime Minister's office. That is a purely partisan operation trying to use taxpayers' money to re-elect a Harper government, and that's quite wrong. We also need, in the course of that discussion on democracy, to redress the democratic deficit and make sure that every single member of Parliament elected to Ottawa fulfills a meaningful role, that they're not there to report to the spin doctors and political strategists of their party. They're there to report to the Canadians who elected them. And in that discussion on democracy, we need to ask the question so that Canadians can participate in the conversation: does the first past the post system work for you? Does it leave you as a voter feeling that your vote doesn't count because you're a conservative in a safe Liberal riding, or you're a Green in a riding that always goes conservative, or you're a Liberal in a place that tends to always vote NDP? Do you feel there's no point in voting because my vote won't count? And that's a significant issue for Canadians. I think we need to get out on the road. We need to have hearings. We need to exchange about this question, and then we can put it to a referendum nationally, follow the guidance of other Commonwealth nations like Australia and New Zealand, and find a way to reform our Parliament so that every vote counts. Thank you for your time. I have a feeling you probably all have other places you have to run to be. If anyone has any more questions for me, I'm not going anywhere. Happy to talk to anyone one-on-one. I appreciate your patience, and thank you for being here this evening.